The sun hangs low over the prairie, casting long shadows across rows of wooden barracks that stretch toward the horizon like grave markers. Inside one of those barracks, a 24-year-old German soldier named Ernst Kohlers sits on the edge of his cot, holding a letter that arrived 3 days ago from Bremen. The envelope is creased and worn, passed through too many hands across too many miles. The handwriting is his father's, but the trimmer in the letters is new. His father writes that the neighborhood where Ernst learned to ride a bicycle no longer exists. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The shipyard where 3 generations of Kohlers worked has been reduced to twisted metal and ash. Ernst's brother, Henrik, was last seen heading east toward the Soviet lines. No one has heard from him since February. The letter ends with a single sentence that Ernst has read so many times he has memorized the shape of each word. I do not know if there will be anything left when you return. Ernst folds the letter along its original creases and slides it into a cigar box beneath his bunk. Then he stands and walks to the doorway of the barracks, looking out across the Oklahoma landscape. The grass is tall and green, swaying in the evening breeze. In the distance, he can see cattle grazing on land that stretches unbroken to the edge of the sky. Somewhere beyond the camp perimeter, a dog barks. The sound of an automobile engine rumbles past on a distant road. The air smells of earth and wildflowers and the promise of rain. Earlier that morning, the camp loudspeakers crackled to life with an announcement that changed everything. The war in Europe was over. Germany had signed the instrument of unconditional surrender. For the American soldiers stationed at Camp Gruber, it was a day of jubilation. For Ernst and the 1,200 other German prisoners held in Oklahoma, it was the beginning of something else entirely. It was the start of a countdown they had been dreading for months. A countdown to the moment when they would be loaded onto trains and ships and sent back to a Germany that existed now only in memory and ruin. Ernst does not feel joy at the news of peace. He feels something closer to terror. Because in the 2.5 years he has spent as a prisoner of war in Oklahoma, he has come to understand a truth that would have seemed impossible when he first arrived. He is safer here, in captivity, than he will be when they set him free. This is not the story of victory. It is the story of what happened in the space between enemies and neighbors, in the quiet hours when men who should have been killing each other were instead learning each other's names. When the first German prisoners arrived in Oklahoma in the summer of 1943, they came with minds shaped by years of propaganda and the hard education of war. Most had been captured in North Africa, swept up in the collapse of German and Italian forces after the defeat at El Alamein and the subsequent Allied invasion of Tunisia. Others had been taken in Sicily or Italy itself, during the grinding campaigns up the peninsula. They were soldiers who had known heat and sand and the particular fear that comes from being outgunned and surrounded. They had been told many things about what would happen if they fell into enemy hands. They had been told that the Americans were soft and undisciplined, that their military was chaotic and their treatment of prisoners brutal. They had been told that capture meant torture, forced labor unto death, execution without trial. They had been told to fight to the last bullet and save the final one for themselves. These were the stories that the Reich fed its soldiers, stories designed to make surrender unthinkable. The reality they encountered was so fundamentally different that many of them spent the first weeks in a state of disbelief. The train journey from the port of embarkation to Oklahoma took several days, passing through landscapes that seemed impossibly vast and untouched by war. They saw cities with lights burning at night, towns where shops were open and streets were filled with civilians going about ordinary business. They saw farmland that stretched for hundreds of miles without a single bomb crater, bridges that stood intact, factories with smoke rising from their chimneys. It was a country that was fighting a war on two fronts and yet showed no visible signs of deprivation or desperation. Camp Gruber itself was a revelation. Built originally as a training facility for American infantry divisions, the camp covered 40,000 acres of rolling prairie land south of Muskogee. When the prisoners arrived, they were processed through a system that was methodical and impersonal but not cruel. They were photographed, fingerprinted, examined by medical personnel who checked for wounds and disease. They were issued clean uniforms, assigned to barracks, and given an orientation briefing in German by an American officer who spoke the language with a Bavarian accent. Then they were taken to the mess hall. What they found there was the first crack in the edifice of everything they had been taught. The tables were set with metal trays divided into sections. The trays were filled with food. Not the watery soup and sawdust bread that had become standard fare in the Wehrmacht as supply lines collapsed. Not the scraps and spoilage that soldiers learned to stomach when there was nothing else. But actual food prepared in quantities that suggested abundance rather than scarcity. There was meat, real meat, not the mystery protein that came in tins. There were potatoes mashed with butter. There were vegetables, green beans and carrots that had not been boiled into gray mush. There was bread that was white and soft, not the dense black loaves that could break a tooth. There was coffee, hot and strong. There was dessert. There was more food on a single tray than many of them had seen in a week of military rations. A prisoner named Walter Zimmerman, who would later be interviewed by researchers from Oklahoma State University in 1989, described the moment with stark clarity. We stood there holding our trays and we could not move. We looked at the food and then at each other. Someone behind me said, "This must be a trick. They are showing us what we cannot have." But it was not a trick. They told us to sit and eat. So we sat. And we ate. And some of the men wept while they ate because it had been so long since they had tasted anything that reminded them of being human. The abundance was not a temporary gesture meant to impress new arrivals. It was standard policy maintained throughout the duration of their imprisonment. Under the Geneva Convention of 1929, prisoners of war were to be treated humanely, provided with adequate shelter and nutrition, given access to medical care, and allowed to correspond with family. The United States adhered to these requirements not out of sentiment but out of strategic calculation. American soldiers were being held in German and Japanese prison camps, and compliance with international law was meant to ensure reciprocal treatment. For the prisoners themselves, the motivation behind the policy mattered less than its effects. They were living better as captives in Oklahoma than they had lived as soldiers of the Third Reich. The barracks were sturdy wooden structures equipped with cots and mattresses and blankets. The latrines were clean and functional. There were showers with hot water. There was a medical clinic staffed by German doctors who were themselves prisoners but given the supplies and authority to treat their fellow captives. There were recreational facilities scattered throughout the camp. Volleyball courts appeared in the spaces between barracks. Soccer fields were laid out on the prairie grass. A makeshift theater was constructed where prisoners organized concerts and plays, performing works by Goethe and Schiller, staging comedies and dramas that allowed them to maintain some connection to the culture they had left behind. There was a library stocked with German-language books, novels and histories and technical manuals, materials that let educated men continue their intellectual lives even in confinement. There were workshops where prisoners could practice trades or learn new skills. Men who had been carpenters or metalworkers before the war were given tools and materials to work with. Others learned skills they had never had the opportunity to acquire in civilian life. The camp command encouraged these activities, seeing them as a way to maintain order and morale, to keep men occupied and productive rather than idle and resentful. The contrast with what they had known was almost incomprehensible. Ernst Kohler had spent the winter of 1942 on the Eastern Front, where temperatures dropped to 30 below zero and men froze to death in their foxholes. He had seen soldiers eating bark from trees when rations failed to arrive. He had watched friends die from infections that could have been cured with basic antibiotics that were not available. He had learned what it meant to be expendable, to be a number in a war machine that consumed men without regard for their humanity. Oklahoma was different in ways that defied easy articulation. The landscape itself seemed designed to mock the austerity of wartime Europe. The prairie stretched endlessly under skies so wide they made a man feel small but not insignificant. The grass was green even in summer, fed by rains that came regularly and without the accompaniment of artillery. The air smelled clean, free from the stench of cordite and burning fuel and decomposing flesh that had become the olfactory signature of the war. The seasons passed with a gentleness that felt almost absurd. Autumn brought cooler temperatures and the turning of leaves on the oak and hickory trees that dotted the campgrounds. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Winter was cold but not lethal, nothing like the killing cold of Russia. Spring arrived with wildflowers that carpeted the prairie in colors the prisoners had nearly forgotten existed. Summer was hot and dry, but there was shade to be found and water to drink, and no one was shooting at them. This was the paradox that the prisoners struggled to process. They were confined, yes. They were behind wire, yes. They were subject to rules and regulations and the authority of armed guards. But they were also safe. They were fed. They were treated with a baseline of respect that many had not experienced even in their own military. And slowly, over weeks and months, this realization began to reshape the way they understood the world. The letters from home arrived irregularly, delayed by the chaos of a continent at war and the bureaucratic machinery of mail censorship. But they arrived. And what they contained was a chronicle of escalating disaster that made the safety of Oklahoma feel even more surreal. Ernst received letters from his father describing the bombing raids that had become a nightly occurrence in Bremen. The old man wrote about huddling in the cellar while the city shook, about emerging in the morning to find that entire blocks had been erased overnight, about the smell of smoke and bodies that never quite left the air. Other prisoners received similar news. Letters told of cities reduced to rubble. Dresden, Hamburg, Berlin, Cologne. The great urban centers of Germany were being systematically destroyed. Families wrote of starvation, of children who cried from hunger and could not be comforted because there was no food to give them. They wrote of the cold, of winters without fuel for heating, of windows that could not be replaced because there was no glass, of living in ruins because there was nowhere else to go. They wrote of the fighting that continued to rage even as it became clear that the war was lost. Men conscripted in their 50s and boys as young as 14 were being sent to the front with minimal training and inadequate equipment. The Eastern Front had become a meat grinder consuming what remained of Germany's manpower. The Western Allies were advancing steadily, liberating France and the Low Countries, pushing toward the Rhine. The Reich was collapsing, and everyone knew it, but the fighting continued with a ferocity born of desperation. For the prisoners in Oklahoma, these letters created a psychological dissonance that was almost unbearable. They read about their families suffering and could do nothing to help. They learned that the places they had known as children no longer existed. They absorbed the news that friends and brothers and fathers had been killed, and they did this while sitting in barracks that were warm and dry, while eating meals that filled their stomachs, while looking out at a landscape that war had never touched. Ernst would read his father's letters and then walk out into the Oklahoma evening, and the contrast would hit him like a physical blow. Here the world was green and growing. Here there was peace, or at least the absence of violence. Here men could sleep without fear of bombs falling or soldiers kicking in doors in the middle of the night. The guilt was crushing. The sense of helplessness was worse. But beneath the guilt and helplessness, another feeling was growing. A feeling that Ernst did not want to acknowledge because it seemed like a betrayal of everything he was supposed to believe. He was beginning to understand that he did not want to go back. That the Germany he had known was gone, and what was taking its shape was something he did not recognize and did not want to face. That captivity in Oklahoma, for all its restrictions and indignities, was preferable to freedom in a nation that had destroyed itself. Under the provisions of the Geneva Convention, prisoners of war could be required to work, but they had to be compensated, and the work could not be directly related to the war effort. The United States implemented a labor program that sent German prisoners to work in agriculture, manufacturing, and other industries where the shortage of civilian workers had become acute. By 1944, with millions of American men serving overseas, the labor shortage had reached crisis levels. Farmers could not harvest their crops. Factories could not maintain production. The prisoners filled this gap. In Oklahoma, the need was particularly acute in the agricultural sector. The state was a major producer of wheat, cotton, and cattle, industries that required intensive seasonal labor. Branch camps were established throughout the state, smaller facilities connected to the main camps at Gruber, Alva, and Tonkawa. These branch camps were often nothing more than clusters of barracks surrounded by wire, set up in the middle of farming country where the prisoners could be put to work immediately. Ernst was assigned to a branch camp near the town of Okmulgee, south of Tulsa in the heart of Oklahoma's cotton country. The camp held about 200 men, and their primary work was in the cotton fields during harvest season and in various maintenance and construction projects during the rest of the year. The work was hard, physically demanding in a way that military service often was not. Picking cotton required a man to spend hours bent over in the sun, filling sacks that grew heavier with each row. But the work had a rhythm to it, a predictability that was almost comforting. There were no artillery barrages, no sudden attacks, no moments of terror when everything depended on reflexes and luck. There was just the cotton, row after row stretching toward the horizon, and the methodical task of harvesting it. The prisoners worked in teams, supervised by a handful of American guards who were mostly older men deemed unfit for combat duty or younger men recovering from wounds that had sent them home from the war. The prisoners were paid for their labor. The rate was 80 cents per day, issued in the form of canteen coupons that could be used to purchase items at the camp store. Cigarettes, candy, toiletries, writing paper, stamps. Small luxuries that gave men a sense of agency, a feeling that they had some control over their lives even within the larger structure of captivity. Some prisoners saved their coupons, accumulating small fortunes in camp currency. Others spent freely, enjoying the simple pleasure of being able to choose something for themselves. The farmers who employed the prisoner labor were initially skeptical. Many had sons or nephews serving in Europe, and the idea of working alongside German soldiers felt wrong, almost treasonous. But necessity overrode sentiment. The crops needed to be harvested, and there was no one else to do it. The prisoners worked efficiently and without complaint. They followed instructions. They did not cause trouble. Slowly, the farmers began to see them not as enemy soldiers but as laborers, as men doing a job. This shift in perception happened gradually and unevenly, but it happened. A farmer named Thomas Pritchard, who owned 300 acres of cotton land near Okmulgee, was interviewed by a local newspaper in 1944. He said, "I never thought I would say this, but those German boys are the best workers I have ever had. They show up on time, they do not complain, and they take pride in their work. I lost my oldest boy at Anzio, and I thought I would hate every German I saw. But hate is hard to maintain when you are working side by side with a man every day." Small interactions accumulated over time, creating connections that neither side had anticipated. A guard would share a cigarette with a prisoner during a break. A farmer's wife would send extra sandwiches in her husband's lunch pail, knowing that he would share them with the work crew. A prisoner would fix a broken piece of farm equipment, demonstrating a skill that saved the farmer money and earned a quiet word of thanks. Children who lived on farms near the work sites were fascinated by the prisoners. They would watch from a distance as the men worked, these strange figures in faded uniforms speaking a language that sounded harsh and foreign. Sometimes a prisoner would wave. Sometimes a child would wave back. These moments of contact, brief and seemingly insignificant, were the threads that began to weave a different kind of relationship. Ernst worked under the supervision of a man named Roy Fletcher, who managed a cotton gin and coordinated the labor crews during harvest. Fletcher was in his late 50s, a veteran of the First World War who walked with a limp from a bullet wound taken at Belleau Wood. He spoke little, watched everything, and treated the prisoners with a gruff fairness that Ernst came to respect. Fletcher did not socialize with the prisoners, but he did not abuse them either. He gave orders, expected them to be followed, and acknowledged good work with a brief nod or a word of approval. One afternoon in September 1944, Ernst was working on repairing a section of fence when Fletcher approached. The older man stood watching for a moment, then spoke. "You know what you are doing?" Ernst looked up, surprised. He had not expected conversation. "I worked construction before the war," Ernst replied in his heavily accented English. Fletcher nodded. "That is good. We need men who can use their hands." He paused, then added, "My son is over there. In France somewhere." Ernst did not know what to say. He settled for, "I hope he is safe." Fletcher looked at him for a long moment. "So do I," he said. Then he walked away. It was not friendship. It was not forgiveness. But it was acknowledgement. An acknowledgement that both men were caught in circumstances neither had chosen, that both were trying to navigate a situation that defied easy categories of right and wrong, enemy and ally. These small moments of recognition, repeated across hundreds of interactions between prisoners and civilians, began to erode the abstractions that war requires. The enemy was no longer a faceless threat. The enemy was Ernst Kohler, who knew how to fix a fence and worried about whether his family in Bremen had enough to eat. By the winter of 1944, the patterns of daily life in the camps had settled into something that resembled normalcy, if normalcy could exist behind wire under armed guard. The prisoners woke at dawn, ate breakfast, were marched to work sites or assigned to duties within the camp. They worked through the morning and afternoon with breaks for lunch and rest. They returned to camp in the evening, ate dinner, and had a few hours of free time before lights out. During those evening hours, the camps came alive with activity. Men wrote letters home, knowing the letters would take months to arrive and might not arrive at all. They played cards, rehearsed for theater productions, practiced musical instruments if they had access to them. They argued about politics and philosophy, debated the war's progress, speculated about when they might be sent home and what they would find when they got there. Ernst spent many evenings in conversation with a fellow prisoner named Otto Brenner, a former schoolteacher from Munich who had been drafted in 1942 and captured in Tunisia the following year. Otto was older, in his mid-30s, and possessed a sardonic wit that made even the grimness of their situation bearable. They would sit outside the barracks on warm evenings, watching the sun set over the prairie, and Otto would talk about the absurdity of their lives. "We are prisoners," Otto would say, "but we live better than we did as free men. We are enemies of America, but Americans feed us better than our own government ever did. We were told that democracy makes nations weak, but look around. This nation is fighting wars on both sides of the world and has not missed a meal. What does that say about everything we were taught?" Ernst did not always have answers. He was not given to philosophical speculation. But he listened, and he thought about what Otto said, and he began to see that the teacher was right. Everything they had been told was a lie. Not just some things. Everything. The Reich had promised glory and delivered catastrophe. It had promised strength and shown only brutality. It had promised a future and instead had burned the past to ashes. The propaganda had been pervasive and relentless. From childhood, Ernst's generation had been taught that Germans were superior, that they were destined to rule Europe, that the weak democracies of the West would crumble before the disciplined might of the Reich. They had been taught that Slavs were subhuman, that Jews were parasites, that anyone who opposed National Socialism was a traitor to the race and the nation. In Oklahoma, those teachings could not survive contact with reality. The Americans were not weak. They were overwhelmingly powerful, possessed of industrial and agricultural capacity that dwarfed anything Germany had ever achieved. The democracy that was supposed to make them soft had instead made them resilient, able to mobilize resources and manpower on a scale that the centralized dictatorship of the Reich could not match. The people who were supposed to be decadent and mongrelized were instead prosperous and confident, going about their lives with a casual ease that spoke of a society that functioned rather than one that was held together by terror and lies. Ernst watched American guards and tried to reconcile them with the propaganda. These were not the brutal, stupid, racially inferior creatures he had been told about. They were ordinary men. Some were kind, some were indifferent, a few were petty tyrants who enjoyed the small power they held over the prisoners. But they were individuals, not representatives of some imagined racial category. They had families, told jokes, complained about their duties, showed photographs of girlfriends and children. They were human in all the messy, complicated ways that humans are. The civilians the prisoners encountered while working reinforced this understanding. The farmers were hardworking and practical, concerned with weather and crop prices and the mechanics of keeping a farm running during wartime. The women who occasionally brought food or supplies to the work sites were curious and sometimes wary but rarely hostile. The children were just children, fascinated by strangers and oblivious to the ideological categories that adults imposed on the world. One day in late autumn, Ernst was part of a work crew repairing a barn roof on a farm outside Okmulgee. The farmer's daughter, a girl of perhaps 8 or 9, stood watching them work. She had blonde hair and wore a faded blue dress and regarded the prisoners with the solemn attention that children bring to anything that interests them. At one point, she approached Ernst and held out an apple. "For you," she said simply. Ernst took the apple, surprised. "Thank you," he managed to say. The girl smiled and ran back to the house. It was a small gesture, meaningless in the grand scheme of things. But Ernst thought about it for days afterward. That child had no reason to show him kindness. He was an enemy soldier, or representative of a nation that was killing American boys in Europe. But she had given him an apple because she saw a man on a roof who might be hungry. She had not seen an enemy. She had seen a person. And in that moment, something in Ernst shifted. He could not hold on to the propaganda anymore. He could not believe that these people were his enemies in any meaningful sense. They were just people, living their lives, trying to get through a war they had not asked for, same as everyone else. The announcement came on May 8, broadcast through the camp loudspeakers in both English and German. The war in Europe had ended. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. Adolf Hitler was dead. The Third Reich, which had promised to reshape the world, had lasted 12 years and had left nothing behind but mountains of corpses and cities reduced to rubble. In Washington and New York, in every American town and city, people celebrated. Church bells rang. Strangers embraced in the streets. Mothers wept with relief knowing their sons would not have to fight anymore. The war was over. Victory had been achieved. Inside Camp Gruber and its branch facilities scattered across Oklahoma, the news was received in silence. In the mess hall where Ernst heard the announcement, men sat frozen with forks halfway to their mouths. In the barracks, prisoners lay on their cots staring at nothing. In the work yards, groups gathered and spoke in whispers, trying to process what they had just learned. For them, this was not liberation. It was a sentencing. The machinery of repatriation would now begin. They would be sent back. Back to a Germany that existed only as ruins and chaos. Back to cities without roofs or windows or hope. Back to a future that held nothing but suffering. Ernst felt his chest tighten as the reality settled over him. He would have to leave Oklahoma. He would have to leave this place where he had been safe, where he had been fed, where he had been treated like a human being. He would be returned to Bremen, to a city his father described as unrecognizable, to streets that no longer had names because the buildings that had defined them were gone. He would go back to a nation that had lost everything, including its soul. And he would do this as a defeated soldier of a regime that history would rightly condemn as monstrous. The despair was immediate and visible. Guards reported that some prisoners refused to eat in the days following the announcement. Others became withdrawn, speaking to no one, moving through their duties like automatons. The chaplain at Camp Gruber wrote in his report that the mood among the prisoners had shifted from stable to despondent overnight. "They are terrified," he wrote. "They do not want to return. Some have told me they would prefer to remain prisoners indefinitely rather than face what awaits them in Germany." This was not irrational fear. The letters from home had made the situation clear. Germany was divided into occupation zones controlled by the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. The infrastructure was destroyed. Millions were homeless. Food was scarce. The black market ruled what remained of the economy. Former soldiers faced denazification proceedings, interrogations designed to determine their level of complicity with the regime's crimes. Those who had been members of the Nazi Party or the SS faced potential prosecution. Even ordinary conscripts faced suspicion and hostility from a population looking for someone to blame for the catastrophe. In Oklahoma, by contrast, life had been predictable. The prisoners had their routines, their work, their small comforts. The camp had become familiar. The guards were known quantities. The civilians they worked alongside had names and faces. It was not freedom, but it was safety. It was stability. It was a life that made sense in ways that returning to Germany no longer did. Ernst understood this with a clarity that was almost painful. He had more to lose by leaving captivity than by remaining in it. The transformation that had been occurring slowly over the past 2 years now accelerated. The ideology that had sustained Ernst through his youth and his military service could no longer withstand the weight of evidence. The propaganda had promised German superiority and had delivered total defeat. It had promised glory and had produced only shame. It had promised a future and had instead destroyed the past. Every claim the Reich had made had been exposed as a lie. The concentration camps were being documented now, photographed and filmed by Allied forces who wanted the world to see what had been done. The camp newspapers published articles about Dachau, Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen. Photographs showed piles of skeletal corpses, mass graves, gas chambers disguised as shower rooms. The scale of the killing was beyond comprehension. Millions murdered in an industrialized system of death. Women, children, elderly people, all classified as undesirable and exterminated like vermin. Ernst read these accounts with growing horror. Some prisoners insisted the reports were exaggerations, Allied propaganda designed to justify the war and demonize Germany. But Ernst could not sustain that denial. He had seen how the propaganda lied about everything else. Why would it tell the truth about this? The regime he had served, the nation he had fought for, had committed atrocities that would stain German identity for generations. He had been part of that. Not directly, perhaps. He had never worked in a camp, never participated in the murders. But he had worn the uniform. He had fought for the Reich. He bore that guilt whether he wanted to or not. The treatment he had received in Oklahoma stood in stark contrast to everything the propaganda had taught him. He had been told that Americans were weak, decadent, incapable of discipline or organization. Instead, he had found a nation of staggering power and efficiency, one that could wage war on 2 fronts while maintaining prosperity at home. He had been told that democracy made nations vulnerable. Instead, he had seen a system that mobilized resources and manpower more effectively than any dictatorship. He had been told that the enemy would be brutal and cruel. Instead, he had been treated with a basic decency that his own military had rarely shown its soldiers. These contradictions forced a reckoning. Ernst had to confront the possibility that everything he believed was wrong. That the cause he had fought for was not just defeated but fundamentally evil. That the worldview he had been raised with was built on lies and hatred. It was not an easy process. It required him to dismantle his own identity and rebuild it from scratch. But the evidence was overwhelming. The Reich had been a catastrophe. The ideology had been poison. And he had been on the wrong side of history. Otto Brenner, the teacher from Munich, said it best one evening as they sat outside the barracks watching the sun set. "We were fools," Otto said quietly. "We believed what we were told because it was easier than thinking for ourselves. We followed orders because we were afraid of what would happen if we did not. We convinced ourselves that we were special, that we were destined for greatness, that the suffering we inflicted was justified by some grand historical purpose. But it was all a lie. There was no greatness. There was only death and destruction and shame. And now we have to live with that." Ernst had no argument to offer. Otto was right. They had been complicit, whether actively or through silence and obedience. They could not undo what had been done. They could only acknowledge it and try to become different men. The camps in Oklahoma had given them that opportunity. The safety and the routine and the small acts of kindness from people who owed them nothing had allowed them to step back from the propaganda and see it for what it was. To see themselves for what they were. And to decide, however late, to be something else. The repatriation process began in the summer of 1945 and continued through 1946. Prisoners were processed in batches, loaded onto trains bound for East Coast ports, then transferred to ships that would carry them back to Europe. The camps emptied slowly. The barracks that had been full of voices and activity grew quiet. The workshops closed. The theater productions ended. the work crews that had labored in Oklahoma's fields and factories were disbanded. Within a year, the physical presence of the prisoners was gone. But the connections that had been formed did not disappear. In the years and decades that followed, a number of former prisoners made the journey back to Oklahoma. They came as free men now, tourists or immigrants, seeking out the places where they had been held and the people who had known them during those years. They came because Oklahoma represented something they could not find anywhere else. A place where they had been treated with humanity during the most inhumane period of their lives. Ernst Kohler returned to Oklahoma in 1968. He had spent the intervening years rebuilding his life in Germany. He had married, raised children, worked as a construction foreman helping to rebuild Bremen. But he had never forgotten Oklahoma. He had never forgotten Roy Fletcher or the cotton fields or the wide prairie sky. He saved money for years to make the trip. When he finally arrived in Okmulgee, he asked around until he found someone who knew what had happened to Fletcher. The old man had died in 1962, but his widow still lived on the same farm. Ernst drove out to the property and knocked on the door. Mrs. Fletcher answered, an elderly woman with white hair and cautious eyes. Ernst introduced himself, explained who he was and why he had come. He wanted to thank her husband for treating him fairly during the war. For seeing him as a person rather than just a prisoner. Mrs. Fletcher listened, then invited him inside. They sat in her kitchen drinking coffee, and Ernst told her about those years, about the work he had done, about the small kindnesses her husband had shown. Mrs. Fletcher cried. She said that Roy had spoken of the prisoners sometimes, had said they were good workers, good men caught in a bad situation. She was glad Ernst had come. It meant something to know that Roy's decency had been remembered. Other prisoners made similar journeys. They sought out the farms where they had worked, the towns where they had been held. Some found the people they remembered. Others found only graves and memories. But they came because they needed to close a circle, to acknowledge that the time they spent in Oklahoma had mattered. That it had changed them. That it had shown them a different way of being in the world. The legacy of the camps lived on in other ways as well. Children who had watched the prisoners' work grew up and told their own children about the German soldiers who had picked cotton in their fields. Historians collected oral histories, preserving the testimonies before they were lost to time. Local historical societies erected small markers acknowledging the camp's existence. In 2009, a ceremony was held in Okmulgee commemorating the branch camp that had operated there during the war. 2 former prisoners attended, men in their 80s who had traveled from Germany for the event. They spoke briefly, thanking the community for the treatment they had received, acknowledging the complexity of those years, expressing hope that the lessons learned might not be forgotten. The story of the German prisoners who did not want to leave Oklahoma is not a story that fits easily into conventional narratives about war. It does not celebrate heroism or condemn villainy in simple terms. It is instead a story about what happens when ideology collides with human contact, when propaganda meets lived experience, when enemies are forced to recognize each other as individuals rather than abstractions. It is a story about men who came to Oklahoma as soldiers of a defeated regime and left as witnesses to the possibility of reconciliation. They came expecting cruelty and found decency. They came believing lies and encountered truth. They came as enemies and left as something else, something harder to define, something closer to simply human. The camps are gone now. The barracks have been torn down. The fields where prisoners worked have been harvested by other hands for decades. But the memory remains, preserved in letters and photographs and oral histories, in the stories passed down through families on both sides of the Atlantic. It remains as evidence that even in the darkest times, humanity can assert itself. That systems designed for war can still allow for mercy. That enemies can become witnesses. And that sometimes, the most profound transformations happen not on battlefields but in quiet moments of recognition between people who were supposed to hate each other but chose, however tentatively, to see each other as human instead. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.